We ask ourselves on this fourth week in the Paschal season, what difference can the resurrection of a human body make? What impact does it have on other people, or does it have no impact? And most of all, how is that influence shown through the lives of people who are convinced of this truth? The power that flows from a bodily resurrection, and there is a power, it does have an impact on others. And on this Sunday in Eastertide, we're meditating on how that's very visible and noticeable. For example, in the first lesson we just heard from Acts of the Apostles, and in the epistle, Peter himself is the one speaking or writing. He is exercising leadership, and he is a powerful example of how the resurrection of his leader, Jesus, changes him. This radical change in Peter, this transformation, because Jesus, years before, chose Peter to be the lead apostle, to whom he gave the power of the keys of the kingdom. We know, for example, the background of Peter, which is a contrast to show how resurrection can do things. Peter had great difficulty throughout the public ministry with Jesus' predictions. Peter often misunderstood Jesus several times. For example, we had some weeks ago on one of the Sunday lessons a dramatic confrontation between Peter, Jesus, and the apostles when Jesus predicts that eventually in the future there would be this thing called Holy Week, that Jesus would be rejected by his own fellow Jewish leaders, the high priest and elders and scribes, people who should know better. They will reject him. They will conspire for his crucifixion, his suffering, his death. And Jesus tries to explain this is going to happen in the future to bolster them. And Peter objects. He disagrees. God forbid this should ever happen to you. As if suffering has nothing to do with the kingdom, with salvation. And Jesus sternly reprimands Peter, calling him one of the worst names in the New Testament. Get behind me, you Satan, because you're doing what other people do. You're thinking the way the world thinks, not as the Son of Man thinks. Or, just hours before Jesus is arrested and eventually crucified, at his Last Supper, Jesus predicts that there is a traitor in their midst and he's about to be betrayed. And Peter uses that occasion to brag, to boast. I'll never deny you. And Jesus predicts, before the night's over, you'll do it several times. So this is a strange personality of Peter. Such misunderstanding, such a weak character. Surely people might think that Jesus himself got it all wrong when he gave Simon Peter the keys to the kingdom and imparted some kind of leadership on him. But then Jesus eventually rose from the dead. His predictions came true. He appears. His first appearance is the upper room. There are 10 apostles and they're huddled for fear. They don't understand. Jesus then breathes the Holy Spirit upon Peter and the others. And somehow this power flowing from a risen Jesus has an effect on Peter. Because the power Jesus gives, he says, whose sins you shall forgive are forgiven. You can't talk about bodily resurrection without talking about a moral corruption that later Peter will confront and challenge. Power flowing from the resurrection means forgiveness, restoration, the second chance. It's a forgiveness that's so profound, it can transform people. During his public life, Jesus gave several parables about the transforming power of forgiveness that now he is elevated to be perpetual through all time, even past a crucifixion in a risen person. So the power of forgiveness that transforms people has changed Peter in a radical way. Once dead to his own cowardice and sinfulness, now Peter, very dynamic, very much alive, because he's being raised up by Jesus to a new kind of life. And by the 50th day of Easter, this has sunk in very deeply to the point where we have this beautiful first reading where Peter is preaching to the Israelites. It's this power of Jesus' resurrection that made Peter the kind of man that Jesus wanted Peter to be. And I think when Peter was called by Jesus, Simon Bar-Jonah, Jesus kind of understood that someday we can get this guy put together right and transform him into a brave, courageous man, no longer doubtful, but a very convincing leader. Jesus transformed Peter into that real leader or we would say a shepherd. That's the psalm we chanted today. The Latin word for shepherd is a pastor, a good pastor, exercising the leadership that Jesus, the good shepherd, once imparted through his church. We see this incredible energy flowing this morning in that lesson we just heard. Later, the same kind of change will occur a little few years later in Saul of Tarsus, whom we call St. Paul. He will confront also a risen Christ on the road to Damascus, and that will radically change Paul into a super apostle, but that's coming later. Peter is speaking to us then, not just the past tense, but to all of us when he's speaking to several thousand of his fellow Jews, the Israelites. And what's he saying to them today? And Peter can be very persuasive. He's trying to tell them very simply, what is real religion all about? By now, Peter knows. Real religion means that, well, first of all, for Peter, it's very simple. There is only one person in human history in whom all other humans were going to find their fulfillment in this life and a life to come. We would call that salvation. Salvation, when God himself, and only God, has the capacity to completely reform me, change me into a new creation. And Peter says that man Jesus, whom you once crucified, that's the agent of God. He calls him Messiah, Christ, Lord. That person, Jesus of Nazareth, is the ultimate Jew to this huge gathering of Jewish people, because in his death and resurrection, Jesus himself completes a master plan of God. A master plan of God that began long ago when God called the first believer, Abraham, into a relationship, a partnership that would work through many people for thousands of years, culminating through other great men like Moses or David, who wrote Psalm 23, the Good Shepherd. David, the shepherd boy of Bethlehem, became the greatest king in Israelite history, and David is the ancestor of Jesus, also born in Bethlehem. This is Jesus whom God the Father raised up to be Messiah and Lord of history. Jesus who alone will save every believer from, as Peter says, this corrupt generation. Whether the corruption is from the pandemic virus or from moral corruption, everything that is evil, the Lord wants to draw us from there. The Good Shepherd is leading us into a future. This, then, is the true, authentic religion. To center all our lives, as Peter requests, on the Christ. And from that centering on Christ, the power flowing from Jesus' resurrection is available to us, particularly through the sacraments, such as the Eucharist we are celebrating, whether one can partake physically, which is very few, or spiritually while this pandemic rages. Jesus is the Good Shepherd who tells us himself that the ultimate leader, he's the gate and gateway, and whoever enters through him into the future will be saved. No other person in history can guarantee our fulfillment and salvation. No other religions can accomplish this in the believer except the Christ. And so what is Peter doing today, both in Acts and in his letter? He's giving the most important sermon in his entire life. This true gateway is the Jesus, the Christ. He purchased us as his flock. He gave his life up for us. That's what the shepherd does. We are so valuable to him. He gave his life for our sakes to show and express the ultimate meaning of sacrificial love. And so Peter told us in that letter that the forgiveness of sins that Peter himself experienced, and many, many others, it's connected with, it's part of what resurrection of the body expresses and gives. The resurrection of a person's soul, long before they die, is the prelude to the experience of a resurrection of the body on the last day. So that in that resurrection on the final day, when salvation is made complete and perfected in us, we shall share the life of the Good Shepherd forever. And notice how Peter ends this little excerpt in his letter today. He says, you have not strayed from the flock of Christ. No, you have embraced him and identified yourself with him. That's tested even more severely now in these unusual times, because this Sunday, this May 3rd, it's the 7th Sunday in a row when people everywhere, both Catholics and Christians and really all other religions, are forbidden to assemble in groups to pray on this holy day every Sunday, and for the Jews, the Sabbath, and so forth. This distancing sometimes can be interpreted as I feel distanced from God, deprived of him. However, that's a challenge that God did not cause. But when a person is able to participate perhaps visually through the media or in the prayers of their homes, they understand the absence and the deprivation has increased their longing and aching. And I think it has also increased their sense that whether you're in your home, isolated, sheltering in place, or being very careful when you have to stroll outside the house and distance yourself from other people, you are not distant ever from God. He's not simply captured and enclosed in his church. He's not confined by the walls. The Good Shepherd who rose appears to us in many ways in our very lives, no matter where we find ourselves isolated. So Jesus, our pastor and shepherd, still guides us. He is with us. He is shepherding us now and always.